Director of the Athenaeum, and on the screen you also see the one and only Tess Galen, our events coordinator, who helps everything run so smoothly for our programs and provides the wonderful music, Irish shanties. And our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Christopher Bonner from the University of Maryland at College Park, who I will introduce more appropriately and properly in a moment. I am so thrilled that every single one of you chose to be with us tonight before tuning in for the first presidential debate. I hope that what you hear and what we converse about tonight will be good food for your soul, for your brain, before we head into that political mudfest that tonight will be. And we'll stir you up with great ideas and resolve for how we make this a more perfect union. I want to invite all of you, whether you are a decades-long shareholder, a new member, or a guest, especially our guests from the New York Society Library and everyone else. We hope that you'll feel welcomed into our community as a vital part of our tradition of intellectual curiosity, deep passion for the history and welfare of our city and our country and our world, and a belief that engagement with history and literature, with the sciences, our built environment, and with one another in honest dialogue are all vital to creating a vibrant and healthy society. If you enjoy the programming that you receive from the Athenaeum and you are a guest tonight, I hope that you will join us as a member and that you will invite your friends and your neighbors to join as well. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I want to take care of a little housekeeping. When the screen goes up, the PowerPoint, Dr. Bonner's PowerPoint, I invite you to make sure that you click at the top right-hand corner, the speaker view. That will mean that you will just see Dr. Bonner talking along with his PowerPoint instead of Tess and I during that time also, and that may help you with your viewing. I also invite you at any time during his talk to put your questions in the Q&A icon that's at the bottom of the screen. And I will moderate, after he finishes his talk, I will moderate the questions with him and we'll have a nice Q&A time. We'll aim to end right about 7 o'clock or just a little thereafter so that everybody can get their dinner, what do we drink, our whiskey or whatever after that pirate shanty, and prepare for the rest of the evening. Tonight, I hope you'll warmly join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Christopher Bonner. Dr. Bonner is an associate professor in the history department, as I said, at the University of Maryland at College Park. He's a specialist in African American history and the 19th century United States. Dr. Bonner started his path as a historian at Howard University and earned his doctorate from Yale University, where he studied with David Blight, among many other illustrious names, where his name is also now joining. He has been a regular contributor to various academic journals and blogs, and you can follow some of his courses on the C-SPAN History Channel. This evening, Dr. Bonner invites us to enter the world he encountered in the research and writing of his new book, Remaking the Republic, Black Politics and the Creation of American Citizenship, to a pre-Civil War time when Americans had not codified the meanings and privileges of citizenship, when African Americans in the northern states used the idea of citizenship to fight and demand for rights and protections, and in so doing, helped shape our legal understanding of citizenship. I invite you to join me in a warm welcome tonight of Dr. Christopher Bonner. Welcome.
Thank you, Beth and Tess, of course, and thanks to all of y'all for putting this together. I'm really glad to be here. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. All right. So yeah, thank you again for taking the time to come out. I'm looking forward to being able to share some of the work, share with you some of the work that I've been doing recently, and to talk about African American politics, and maybe in the Q&A we'll have our own political mud fight. We'll see how it goes. So in my talk this evening, I'll outline some of the big ideas that move through my book. I'll tell two stories that reflect some of the forms of Black politics that I explore in the project. And I'll offer some thoughts about how my scholarship connects with or intersects with discussions surrounding Black politics today. The title for this talk is Runaways or Citizens Claimed as Such. I'll start with a question. What does citizenship mean to you? What does it mean to say a person is a citizen? Typically, when I ask questions like this, I get a wide range of answers or responses. I get a sense from some people that they're interested in thinking about the specific rights that citizenship confers. Some people might mention broader benefits of citizen status, things like access to the law. Some people might think about things like access to physical territory that's claimed by a national government. Or they might talk about intangible things, things like belonging in a nation or a community. It's important that there are so many different ways to approach this question. Citizenship remains contested ground today. At the same time that people are trying to claim particular rights as citizens, others are working to deny certain groups access to the benefits of citizenship. It's also important that even when people don't agree on what exactly citizenship means, they tend to have strong ideas about it. People do seem to agree that citizenship is a significant marker of a person's legal identity, that it offers tangible and intangible benefits. People generally agree that citizenship is a thing worth fighting for. None of these qualities of citizenship are new. Since the beginning of the United States, people have disagreed about the precise terms of citizenship, even when they agreed that it was a thing that was worth fighting for. My book tells a series of stories about African Americans pushing their way into that fight in the early 19th century. I write about free Black people who made claims about what citizenship meant in the hope that they could change the legal terms of their lives in the United States. In their words and their actions, Black people made radical arguments about citizenship, and they did critical work to shape the nation's legal development, even as those in positions of power denied them a voice in the lawmaking process. A little context about Black life in the early 19th century. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, several northern states took steps to gradually abolish slavery. New York's Gradual Abolition Law, which you're looking at a piece of in this slide, said that enslaved people born after July 4th, 1799 would be free once they reached age 25 for women or age 28 for men. These kinds of laws slowly created a free Black population in northern states. But at the same time, lawmakers limited Black freedom in profound ways. The US Congress excluded Black men from the military, and many states similarly barred Black men from militias. Ohio required free Black people to put up a $500 bond before they could settle in the state. New York allowed Black men to vote only if they owned $250 worth of real estate, and this equates to about $10,000 in today's money. Faced with these restrictions, Black people turned to citizenship in pursuit of justice. The word citizen appeared 11 times in the original US Constitution, and you're seeing here some of its uses. One of the most significant is that it protects an undefined set of privileges and immunities for American citizens. The document, the Constitution, implied that citizenship could be an important factor in determining a person's legal life, but it didn't name the rights or obligations of citizen status, and it also didn't say who could be a citizen. This uncertainty was powerful for Black activists. No law said African Americans could not be citizens, so Black people insisted they were, and they demanded legal protections under the status. Citizenship became a flexible and potent tool for Black activists. And when they claimed rights as citizens, they contributed to ongoing conversations about the relationships among individuals and governments in the US. So this is the process that I refer to in the book's title. Black folks were remaking the Republic. They were doing work that could change American legal foundations. One of the first things that comes to mind for many people when they think about citizenship is the right to vote. And this was true for Black folks in the 19th century. In 1866, a group of Black New Yorkers said this: "To every man, the ballot is his protection from oppression and wrong, and his shield from the contempt of his fellow men." Suffrage was critical to African Americans' political concerns. And this was the mindset of Willis Augustus Hodges, an African American man who changed his life in pursuit of the vote. In his adolescent years, Hodges must have spent many evenings with a sense of foreboding, worried about the violence that might be visited upon his family once he fell asleep. He was born to free African American parents in 1815, in Princess Anne County, Virginia, near the state's Atlantic coast and just above the North Carolina border. In the late 1820s and the early 1830s, free Black people in the area endured waves of violent attacks at the hands of white bandits who invaded homes, assaulted people, and shot livestock. Willis Hodges later reflected on this campaign of terror. "No free person of color within their reach was safe in person or property," he wrote, "for these wolves had tasted human blood and liked it too well to let it alone." Hodges' parents owned about 200 acres of land and they insisted on remaining in Virginia, but Willis looked elsewhere in search of home. He moved to New York and over the next 2 decades organized protest meetings, participated in political conventions, and then he moved upstate, where he was elected to local office. The terror inflicted on families like the Hodges in Virginia was intended to make real a vision of the United States as a white man's republic. Hodges spent the next decades contesting that vision of his native country and working to change the legal terms of his life. When he arrived in New York in 1833, Willis Hodges was immediately disappointed at the state of Black freedom in the North. He was surprised to learn that most Black New Yorkers struggled to support themselves with work as waiters, cooks, or dock workers. And he quickly realized that the law that restricted Black voting rights reflected a broader prejudice that constrained Black freedom in the state. Eventually, Hodges was fortunate to find stable work, and within a few years, he was actually able to save enough money to open a small grocery store, which he ran with one of his brothers who left Virginia and joined him in the North. As Hodges came to understand the legal and economic disabilities under which Black New Yorkers lived, he took steps to try to improve the terms of Black freedom in the state. He immersed himself in the culture of Black protest. In 1840, he went to a Black state convention in Albany to represent fellow residents of what was then the developing community of Williamsburg, Brooklyn. The Black conventions were meetings that took place across the North beginning in the 1830s. People got together and they talked about the problems they faced, and then they tried to agree on public statements they could make to advocate for change. So Hodges and other delegates at the 1840 convention issued a sharp critique of the property requirement for Black suffrage. They said it was a violation of justice because it deprived us of those rights which should have been enjoyed in common by all native-born citizens. Hodges also attended a Black convention in 1841, and while he was there, he outlined an emerging set of ideas about a different Black future. He urged Black people to adopt an agrarian lifestyle. He reasoned that if Black New Yorkers, oops, we're not quite ready for there yet. Oh, no, we are. This is fine. Hodges reasoned that if Black New Yorkers moved upstate and acquired cheap land of their own, then they would be free from the economic struggles of the cities, and they would have access to a variety of new opportunities. Hodges and others believed that by moving west and helping to develop new communities, Black people might influence local laws, and they might move segments of the country toward racial equality. In 1847, Hodges helped organize the New York Emigration Association, which was a group that was planning to establish a Black settlement upstate. He said that around this time, he had become convinced that something besides speechifying had to be done if we wanted our rights. After a series of meetings of the Emigration Association, he joined with 8 other Black families, left Brooklyn, and settled on 40 acres in the Adirondacks in 1848. These Black folks made their homes on land provided by the wealthy white abolitionist Gerrit Smith. In the 1840s, Smith offered 3,000 Black New Yorkers land upstate, hoping that his land grants would make it possible for more African-American men to vote and that their communities might help change white people's mindsets about the morality of slavery. Any Black person between the ages of 21 and 60 who did not already own land and was not a drunkard would be eligible for a 40 to 60 acre plot. Smith expressed serious concerns about drinking among Black New Yorkers. "I'm grieved to learn that intemperance has made such havoc among the colored people of this state," Smith wrote. "Vain and worse than vain will be my grant of land to a drunkard." Recruiters seeking settlers to the Smith lands lied to their readers. "The grant to you is free, untrammeled, unconditional," they wrote. This grant was not at all unconditional. Garrett Smith was looking for a particular type of settler. His approach implied that the right to vote should be available only to Black people who followed a specific, narrow moral path. Willis Hodges apparently fit the bill. He made his home in Franklin County, and while he lived there, he was elected to the position of town collector. I'm not exactly sure what his role was in that position, but it's a really incredible turn in his story. Winning that election offered a direct form of government engagement, and it affirmed Hodges' legal position in the state and the nation. Settling on the Smith lands allowed him to secure that position. So Hodges' story is a striking reflection of Black politics in action during the 19th century. He embodied important ideas about the significance of formal political power and the avenues Black people might travel to attain it. In Franklin County, Hodges rejected the idea that the United States was a country intended to be ruled by white men. But while Hodges illuminates the legal possibilities of Black life in the 19th century, it's important to keep in mind how peculiar his experience was. He was born to free parents who were able to give him a basic education, which was quite rare in the South. He also had enough disposable income to relocate to New York and then to move again upstate in pursuit of political influence. It was those rare opportunities that made it possible for Hodges to gain the formal political position that Black activists had so long tried to secure. So when we see the story in this light, what we can see is that what Hodges won was at best a contingent citizenship. The status he pursued and gained in Franklin County was not available equally to African Americans. Black people made arguments about the terms of citizenship as they struggled to secure rights, but their arguments were often responses to the restrictive terms that conferred rights on a narrow set of white men. Jumping the high hurdle that the state erected on the path to Black voting rights did not confront or challenge the racial inequality at the heart of the law. Instead, when Hodges moved to the Adirondacks and when he renounced all intoxicating drinks, Hodges assumed the burden of his Blackness. He urged other African Americans to do the same, to navigate the world under the legal weight of racism. And so Hodges' life underlines some of the critical differences between legal protection and liberation. Black politics was complex in the 19th century, as it is now, and folks had concerns beyond formal political access. I'll shift now to a story about a man named William Dixon that helps us look beyond the vote. This story offers a fuller sense of the strategies and objectives of African American politics in the early 19th century. William Dixon's name emerged in the historical record after he was arrested in New York City on a spring morning in 1837. Dixon had left his home on the Bowery, headed to work, when a stranger grabbed him and brought him to face a judge at City Hall. Arriving in the courtroom, the stranger made his claim. The Black man who called himself William Dixon was actually a fugitive slave named Jake. Allegedly, Jake had run away from Baltimore Dr. Walter Allender 5 years earlier in 1832. In court, the slave catcher referred to Dixon as Allender's Jake. So allegedly, this was a man called Jake who was the property of Dr. Allender. So he was Allender's Jake. Authorities brought Dixon to a cell in the crumbling jail called Bridewell, and they held him there for a week. And then on the morning of April 12th, two sheriffs escorted him out of Bridewell towards City Hall for another hearing before Judge Richard Riker. Under New York law, a single judge could decide whether an alleged fugitive would remain free or be sent into bondage. Judge Riker had a reputation for being a friend to slave owners. He had frequently ruled in their favor and allowed alleged fugitives to be taken to the South. Standing before Judge Riker, the accused man protested his arrest. He insisted that his name was William Dixon. And he said this: "It is hard, Your Honor. It is hard to be thus treated in this land of liberty. I am an innocent man. I'm a free man. It is hard to be torn from my family and thrust into prison like a dog. I demand justice of Your Honor." Judge Riker called for a recess to decide the man's fate, and the sheriffs took Dixon by the arms to escort him back to his cell. New York City Hall stands today as it did on that April afternoon in the middle of an 8-acre park in Lower Manhattan. And so this is one of a few pictures that I took on a research trip when I was in grad school. When I realized that City Hall is the same building that it was in 1837, I went and I took a tour and got a couple of pictures that I liked. After his hearing on April 12th, the sheriffs prepared to lead William Dixon across the park to Bridewell. Flanking the captive, they walked down a grand staircase toward the building's main entrance. I, of course, did not take this photograph. But as the sheriffs ushered Dixon towards the doors of City Hall, they would have looked through the large windows that lined the front of the building, and they would have seen a massive crowd waiting outside. During the hearing, more than 1,000 African Americans had gathered on City Hall Plaza. The sheriffs were apparently unconcerned, but as soon as they stepped outside, the crowd surged forward. Several people attacked the sheriffs with wooden clubs. A black woman standing at the front of the crowd pulled a knife from under her dress and handed it to Dixon. At first, Dixon wasn't sure what to do while these strangers fought for his freedom, but he overcame his shock and he ran west toward Broadway. Then he turned north to seek shelter in the busy city streets. The crowd continued to fight with the authorities. One official ran outside to support the sheriffs, but according to one source, a strapping Negro wench grabbed him in a chokehold, and a group of young black men pretty well pummeled him and tore the coat completely off his back. Meanwhile, Dixon kept moving north along Broadway. A man on horseback tried to stop him, but Dixon's new escort, several black men armed with clubs, protected the fleeing prisoner. When he reached Duane Street just a few blocks from City Hall, Dixon opted to take cover, ducking into a coal cellar to wait out his pursuers. But his freedom was short-lived. A few hours later, a witness tipped off authorities, and they stormed into the cellar, seized William Dixon, and carted him back to Bridewell. So what you're seeing here is a map from the period of Lower Manhattan. The black dot is City Hall, the green dot is Bridewell, and the red is the coal cellar where Dixon stopped and was eventually apprehended. The attempt to rescue William Dixon reflected an important thread in Black and anti-slavery politics of the period. The white abolitionist Henry Clark Wright was dismayed that alleged fugitives had to work harder to prove their cases than alleged slave owners did. Wright said, "Here is the great difficulty in all cases of runaways, or citizens claimed as such. The whole burden of proof is thrown on the colored man." One black New Yorker argued that if the citizen of a free state was claimed as a slave, he or she should be entitled to a jury trial to determine their status. Vocal black and white activists insisted that alleged fugitive slaves were citizens, and that citizenship must protect free people from being sent into bondage. This rhetoric was intended to urge lawmakers to enact measures that would defend an individual's freedom. But the reality was that William Dixon was held captive by a legal system designed to preserve black slavery. The US Constitution empowered slave owners to reclaim fugitives who fled to another state. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 said slave owners could cross state lines to pursue runaways and, theoretically, also allowed them to arrest free black Northerners who they accused of being fugitive slaves. And the simple fact that enslaved people were so valuable meant that black Northerners lived in a precarious freedom. They might be seized mistakenly by slave catchers or maliciously by kidnappers. Kidnapping endangered all black Northerners, and this helps to explain why so many people gathered on City Hall Plaza to try to rescue William Dixon. Black New Yorkers had a history of organizing to defend their freedom. In 1835, an interracial group of abolitionists established the New York Committee of Vigilance, or the NYCV. This group called for new laws to protect free black people. At the same time, they also aided known fugitives who had come north looking for safety. So together they called this work practical abolition. They were doing concrete things to fight both slavery and the dangerous implications of slavery for black freedom. Samuel Cornish was a leader in the NYCV, and he was the editor of the Colored American, a newspaper that printed its first issue just a few weeks before Dixon's arrest. Like others in the Vigilance Committee, Cornish said alleged fugitives should have the protection of a jury trial. But one of the most interesting things about his work from this time is that Cornish was extremely critical of the violent attempt to liberate William Dixon. He said the crowd that gathered outside City Hall was nothing more than a multitude of illiterate people. From his perspective, they weren't acting in a calculated way in pursuit of progress. Instead, the crowd had become mere subjects of passion. There was some legitimacy to his concerns. There were NYCV lawyers leading Dixon's defense. Cornish hoped these lawyers could convince the judge to grant Dixon a jury trial, and that decision might set a precedent for other lawmakers to follow. Cornish doubted that a mob rescue of Dixon would have the same legal potential. But beyond his concerns about political tactics, Cornish was outraged that African Americans had done something he felt was so uncivil. He was especially displeased that women had played prominent roles in the attempted rescue. He said those activist women had degraded themselves, and he added this: "We begged their husbands to keep them at home for the time to come and find some better occupation for them." Cornish addressed this message, as you see here, to the thoughtless part of our colored citizens. He was promoting narrow ideas about who could do meaningful, productive Black political work. Black women were often denied the chance to make their voices heard in Black newspapers and in public meetings and in conventions in the 19th century. Men like Cornish had restrictive ideas about gender. They thought political activity wasn't appropriate for women. But to me, this is one of the things that's really fascinating about the attempted rescue. This kind of politics offered a clear opportunity for Black women to express their ideas in public. I think it's important to think about the woman who stood at the front of the crowd during the rescue, the woman who reached under her dress and pulled out a knife for William Dixon. She did that because she thought it would help secure his freedom. Maybe she relished an opportunity to step outside of what many thought was proper women's work. Or maybe she had done this type of thing several times before. Maybe she had long ago rejected Cornish's ideas about what was acceptable woman's behavior. It's really tough to know this particular woman's activist history. We don't even know her name. But what we do know is important. She chose to take a critical role in Dixon's rescue, and none of the people in the crowd stood in her way. Black women carved out opportunities to make their voices heard, despite some people's efforts to silence them. This woman's actions reflect some important truths about this attempted rescue. African Americans believed Dixon deserved a fair hearing, and they were convinced that the legal structures that were in place would not provide it. Judge Riker was not a reliable judge. The mob action was about defending Dixon's freedom, but it was also about more than any single Black person. Attacking sheriffs and judges in order to liberate an alleged fugitive was a protest against the legal structures that imperiled all Black people's freedom. Breaking the law was a critical form of Black politics. Through their actions, the crowd outside of City Hall added their voices to those that were calling for a different legal order in the US, an order that would protect Black freedom as robustly as it defended slave owners' property rights. And so despite what Samuel Cornish wrote, the folks who gathered on City Hall Plaza were far from thoughtless. This is one way that I've been thinking about my book and how it might connect with some of the work and some of the conversations about Black politics that have been in the public eye this summer and into the early fall. People across the country in the past several months have gathered to protest police brutality, motivated in part by a video that shows a police officer killing George Floyd. Some of these protests have involved various forms of violence, and many vocal figures, including President Obama, have criticized protesters who do not fit with their ideas about acceptable forms of Black politics. Obama said of the protesters, "We should condemn the few who resort to violence." People have made similar arguments for a long time, and they made similar arguments, I think, notably about Black protests after uprisings in Baltimore and Ferguson in 2014 and 2015. Again, in those cases, police officers killed Black people, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and people took to the streets to denounce long-standing, unchecked police brutality. At the time, many observers condemned those movements as violent, destructive, unruly, or unproductive. We can see a couple of examples of this in my hometown newspaper, The Washington Post. This from April 2015, peaceful protest shifts focus back to death of Freddie Gray, which is assuming or presuming that violence wasn't an expression of outrage about Gray's killing. Or this headline of a column that begins with the premise, "Rioting makes no sense." But the violence we saw in 2014 and 2015, and what we've seen in the summer of 2020, is only senseless to people who don't try to make sense of it. Violent forms of protest often reflect protesters' political thought. My sense is that this summer, many people might have been more open to thinking critically about violence as protest than they were in 2015. Almost as often as I see people invoke Martin Luther King to issue blanket condemnations of violence, I see others call on King's name and quote his statement that a riot is the language of the unheard. But still, vocal, prominent figures issue sweeping condemnations of violence in politics. I see at least two problems with this kind of statement. First, this criticism obscures the fact that much of the violence we've seen in protests this summer is sparked by police or right-wing agitators violently suppressing protest, and protesters trying to defend themselves against those militarized forces. Second, I worry that this criticism arms the enemies of change. When people set fire to a police station or a police vehicle, it's clear that they're expressing rage about a system that allows police to kill Black people with impunity. Violent protest doesn't necessarily draw attention away from political concerns, but the criticism of violent protest does. To me, people who insist on denouncing certain forms of Black protest sound a bit like commentators who try to limit Black politics to the forms they feel are acceptable. If we're interested in advancing racial justice, racial equality, rather than criticizing particular forms of protest, I think we should continue trying to understand the concerns that might underlay violent or law-breaking protests. The project of racial justice is better served by amplifying reasons for Black rage rather than condemning its results. So this is aligned with some of the work that I try to do in my scholarship. I try to ask questions about why people turn to violence in the effort to rescue William Dixon. If we can see political thought and expression in the violent, unruly attempt to rescue Dixon, we should try to do the same for violent, unruly forms of contemporary Black politics. Violence might be protest. Law-breaking can be politics. We should ask thoughtful questions about the roots of particular political forms. Why might Black Americans choose certain avenues of political expression? What forms of Black thought are represented in collective public acts of lawbreaking? Making sense of these political acts can lead us to see the truth that certain legal structures might need to be broken in order to bring people closer to justice. So to turn back to Dixon's story. In the days after the failed rescue attempt, Dixon's trial continued. His counsel called a number of witnesses, including a white ship captain who testified that he had employed Dixon occasionally since 1831, and also a black barber from Philadelphia who said that he had known Dixon as a free man for 15 years. Walter Allender, Dixon's alleged owner, had to prove a difficult case. The slave called Jake had allegedly run away in 1832, so none of his witnesses could claim to have seen this man for at least 5 years. They then had to prove that after all that time, they could identify one out of the 20,000 free and enslaved African Americans who lived in Baltimore. Judge Riker refused to deliver a prompt decision in the case. He left Dixon to sit in a cell for 3 months. Perhaps Riker spent that time anxious that whatever decision he made, it might lead to more violence on the steps of City Hall. Finally, in July 1837, Dixon's lawyers secured from the judge a writ that allowed Dixon to go free on bail. Under the terms of this writ, Dixon would have to return to court if the judge called him, but for any subsequent hearing, a jury would determine his fate. This writ allowed Dixon to return to his life in New York under some kind of normalcy. It offered an important new layer of legal protection against enslavement. It seemed that Samuel Cornish and William Dixon and the NYCB lawyers had been right to rely on the law and to obey the law in seeking legal protections for Black freedom. Judge Riker responded favorably to their claims, favorably to their legal arguments, and the case could set a valuable precedent for protecting other alleged fugitives in the time to come. In Dixon's story, we can see how people who were denied formal political rights were able to insert their voices and ideas into the spaces where laws were being made. In one sense, my book is all about stories like this. Free African Americans insisting that they should have a role in the lawmaking process and finding creative ways to push their way in. In New York, Black people learned the law and they risked their lives in defense of one another. These were two of the many ways they made themselves heard. Because of this political work, for a brief moment in the 1830s, members of the crowd that rescued William Dixon shaped the local lawmaking process just as much as a Black voter might do in Willis Hodges' community in the Adirondacks. Before I close, there's an epilogue to Dixon's story that I would like to share. It offers another angle on the ways Black people pursued justice in this period. After he was released from jail, Dixon lived in a state of anxiety. He could still be called back to court, or he might be arrested again or kidnapped. Dixon's daily life was a tense experience. Perhaps no single encounter was more frightening than a chance meeting with a runaway slave from Maryland. In his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, Frederick Douglass described the morning he arrived in New York City in 1839, disembarking from a train just after he escaped from bondage in Baltimore. Douglass was lost and lonely, wandering the streets of Lower Manhattan. And so he felt overjoyed when he bumped into a Black man he remembered from Baltimore, a man he recognized as Allender's Jake. "I knew Jake well," Douglass wrote. Douglass had heard that Dr. Allender had sent slave catchers after the runaway. And so Douglass was relieved. He was glad to see that Jake seemed to be thriving in freedom. But as you might imagine, Jake was less than pleased to run into this particular old friend. He announced to Douglass, "I am William Dixon in New York," and he quickly walked away, leaving the more recent runaway alone in an unfamiliar city. Given what Douglass wrote about this encounter, it's worth considering a few more questions about William Dixon's story. Who knew the truth of Allender's Jake? The Black New Yorkers who tried to rescue him understood how difficult it was for any African American to secure freedom through the law. Regardless of whether they knew Dixon was Jake, they knew there were limits to the justice available to him, and they took steps to challenge that legal reality. Did NYCB lawyers know that they were defending a fugitive? If they did, then Dixon and his defense team broke the law repeatedly, brazenly, from inside of New York City Hall. Their lawbreaking helped move toward a precedent that might create new legal protections for Black freedom. The lawyers recruited witnesses, Black and white, who were willing to lie in court in an effort to protect African Americans. For all his condemnation of the attempted rescue, it seems likely that Samuel Cornish, a leader in the Vigilance Committee, also knew the truth about Dixon. This might be why he was so angry about the City Hall mob. Perhaps because Cornish knew how much work had been done in court, he was exasperated that the protest might disrupt a case that had so much legal potential. The case of the runaway slave Jake appears to have involved a series of acts of lawbreaking that took place both in and outside of City Hall. Finally, why did this man lie so ardently about his freedom? And why did he seem to think that it would work? Maybe this was a simple choice for a person determined and desperate, perhaps, to be free. William Dixon was a character, a performance of freedom enacted in the courtroom and on the streets. It was a skillful performance, a high wire act of lawbreaking. His story shows us how well Black Americans understood the law. It shows us how effectively they manipulated and moved through legal structures, making transformative claims about citizenship, rights, and justice in the process. In the 1830s, African Americans deftly navigated the legal landscape of New York, working in print, in court, and in the streets to transform a fugitive slave called Allender's Jake into a free man named William Dixon. Okay, thank you for your time. I will, let's see, stop my slide share here, and I think we'll open up for questions. Is that how we'll do here?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. So if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A. I'll also keep track of the chat if you end up typing them in there. Christopher Bonner is ready to answer them. So one that came early on, wondering if New York was one of the last northern states to free Black people.
So New York was not one of the last, but it was one of the sort of odd. Actually, New Jersey was, maybe surprise, surprise, was one of the late holdouts. There was a long and gradual process of emancipation in New Jersey, and there were also legal measures that were skirted. So there were laws that were enacted that said that before the date of emancipation, slave owners were not allowed to sell their enslaved people to the South. But a lot of slave owners in New Jersey violated that. And so there's a lot of contests over what's going to happen there. New York is one of the slower states to enact or to move toward abolition. And part of that is just like the nature of the Gradual Abolition Law. But ultimately, I think part of what's interesting is that New York was one of the larger northern slave owning states. Some of that was people in New York City who owned enslaved people as domestic laborers, and people who were owned in New York and compelled to do the work of making the city. So constructing roads and buildings and all the things that made it a sort of vibrant commercial hub. A lot of that work was done by enslaved people, and you know, it was begun in the colonial period, and then as the city continued to expand, it was continued into the 19th century. So not one of the last, but it was maybe one of the later states, but not like the last holdout.
And then there was a question related to that about Pennsylvania.
About Pennsylvania's abolition?
Yes.
So now I'm trying to recall what exactly Pennsylvania did. I think that Pennsylvania...
Gradual abolition, right?
Yeah, I think that they enacted a gradual abolition law, but I believe that its final dates of abolition were earlier than New York's. I also think that I think there's a sense, or there's a reality that the extent to which there was a significant Quaker population in the state led to a sort of earlier abolition, especially in the Revolutionary period. So in some ways, Pennsylvania abolition emerged sort of in the moment of the Revolutionary War, in a way that other northern states may not have sort of embraced. Massachusetts, of course, has this series of cases that basically make it impossible for slave owners to hold slaves after about 1780. And so the institution sort of fades out there, and there's actually never an abolition law enacted in Massachusetts. It's just this series of cases that dismantle slavery.
So someone would love to know a little bit about your process of research and discovery. you came upon all this material?
Yeah, so I actually have benefited from. I mean, I first read about William Dixon in a like a digital source packet that was put together by the New York Historical Society, and it was a set of sources about groups like the New York Committee of Vigilance and their work. And I read this, and I was not familiar with the story, and then it sort of came to life to me in relation to these really big political struggles related to concepts of citizenship, and especially about the so one of the things that I had set out to try to do in writing the book was to craft a project about antebellum Black politics that included more voices than those of Black editors or folks like Hodges who were at the conventions. And I thought that this was just such an exciting way to see Black people making a legal statement that it had to sort of go in here. And so once, building on the stuff that the New York Historical Society put together was sort of a process of just finding similar or finding references to this case in other newspapers. And I think that's or other newspaper coverage of William Dixon's case. And that was exciting. There wasn't a lot of sleuthing that I did in this project. It was more like so many of my sources are published Black newspapers and the convention proceedings, which are also published and freely available on the website called coloredconventions.org. So it was more just like digging and sifting through rather than like hunting for particular things. And so it was an exciting kind of moment for me.
You did some research at the library company, didn't you?
Yeah, I've been there twice actually. I was at the library company for a month when I was in grad school, and for a semester while I was here while I was on leave from Maryland. So and that second semester was the semester was really important for me to finish up what's the last chapter of the book, which is about Black politics in the Civil War era, and just like the wealth of materials there was super helpful.
So we've got a lot of interest in this in African American organization, community organizing, committee
Mm-hmm.
work. I'm going to throw out a couple things here, and you can tie them all together. The documented history of community organizations, similar to the New York Committee of Vigilance, the interaction between enslaved persons and free Blacks, as well as the role. Samuel Cornish was a Presbyterian pastor. So what was the role of of churches and church leaders in this work?
Yeah. So I guess I'll try to offer a couple of examples to illustrate some of these things. So I think that the existence of the NYCV is a critical marker of the extent to which free Black Northerners were interested in and working toward the defense of or the liberation of enslaved Black Southerners. And the New York Committee of Vigilance has an analog in Philadelphia, whose records are at the Historical Society, if anybody wants to go check those out. Well, I'm not sure what their status is right now, but so it's a kind of organization that exists in a number of places, and there's all sorts of records that just illustrate the techniques, the tactics. So one of my colleagues, Rick Bell, has written this book recently about kidnapping, and one of the things that he found
he came on July.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the maybe I'll spoil his surprise, but it's in the book, I think. One of the things he found is this like image that was a diagram for how Black Philadelphians should arrange themselves to surround a kidnapper and prevent him from seizing any single Black person. And so it's like this interesting little like clock diagram that says like stand here and arm yourselves or just circle up in order to prevent anyone from being taken into slavery or any fugitive slave from being recaptured and retaken. So there's a lot of that kind of work that's happening. One of the things that the And this is another way that I think about finding like voices beyond those of the published people or like news editors and convention delegates. One of the things that you see in the records from the NYCV is, and the Pennsylvania Committee as well, collections were taken in Black churches, and they will often say like, you know, we gathered $10.12 from the congregation at Bethlehem in the interest of our work, and it's very. I mean, I think it's fascinating to see. You know, we think about abolitionists and the extent to which they were. I think increasingly across the antebellum period, increasingly okay with violating laws like the Fugitive Slave Act. It's fascinating to see that sort of like grassroots, like individual contribution, right? Even people who might not want to or be comfortable going out to City Hall Plaza to beat up some sheriffs, they might give 12 cents in a church for a collection for the Vigilance Committee. I guess I would also say quickly, there's an interesting meeting that I write about that takes place at Shiloh Presbyterian Church that was one time pastored by Cornish, later pastored by Henry Highland Garnett in New York. And it's a meeting of it's like a celebration for the anniversary of the New York Committee of Vigilance. And it ends up being this really contentious event where city police and white rowdies sort of line the walls of the church and essentially try to intimidate Black folks who are holding this meeting. And as this is happening, Samuel Ringgold Ward, who is a Black abolitionist, is standing on the stage and talking about how he's like detailing the number of fugitive slaves that the NYCV has helped to liberate. And so there's this very sort of like brazenness to their work. And I think that in some ways, it's interesting to see that brazenness was being exhibited in the church, and that was sort of, even in this moment of potential violence, it was seen as a sort of space of shelter or comfort for that kind of Black politics.
So this one of our attendees, thank you for the language you're using, enslaved rather than slave. Wondered if you could talk about the importance of using such terms, and if there are terms other than quote owners that can be used.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Thank you for that. I would say that the importance of calling people enslaved is in part about making sure that we recognize that people who were enslaved remained people, that they are not reduced to the fact of their bondage, which can implicitly happen in calling them slaves. I had a conversation with a grad student about this recently, a new grad student who was sort of thinking about like the need to use that language. And what I said is that I use the term enslaved partly as a teaching tool, and then it kind of sort of just stuck. But it's much more important that the work you're doing and the ideas you're conveying actually reflect the peopleness, the persistent humanity of enslaved people. That the language is one part of that, but you know, you have to write about all of the complexities of people who were held in bondage, all of the choices they might have made and all of the constraints in which they made those choices in order to really reflect them as people. The question of slave owners, which is a phrase that I continue to use, is actually one I've also thought about. And I'm not going to say that I'm never going to stop using that term, but one of the words that has been sort of, I guess, maybe sort of come into vogue is enslavers. And this is, I think, one of the things that the historian Edward Baptist does in his book, The Half Has Never Been Told, is try to sort of reframe the language. And he refers to, he disregards the language of plantations and calls them slave labor camps. He disregards the language of slave owners or planters or masters and calls them enslavers in order to recognize. The term enslavers, I think, recognizes the persistent work that was done to hold people in bondage. Again, this is a thing that I think it's viable to do just by talking about slavery in a thoughtful way to show that it was persistent work, persistent choice. I'll say there's not a good way. I like and continue, and I think we'll continue to use the term slave owners, because I think that two of the most critical dimensions of slavery are conveyed in that term. One, that it was a legal relationship, that this person had title to another person, and two, that it was a property relationship, that this was a valuable piece of property that was essential to the national economy, essential to personal wealth. And so I think that slave owner actually continues to convey some of the things that I think are most important about the structures and the realities of slavery.
Just another interesting, the example of Garrett Smith granting land to Black people, but only the ones he saw as, quote, proper or acceptable, was very interesting, especially given land disfranchisement remains a big issue for a lot of Black people. So what was the lasting impact of these grants? Did they help to establish generational wealth for the recipients? Do you have a story of that?
I don't know, but that sounds like, so one of the things that I've thought about, I write about Willis Hodges sort of briefly in the end of one of my chapters, where these ideas of like Black agrarianism come together. And I thought about trying to spin something off and build on his story a little bit further. The short answer is I don't know if there was generational wealth that came out of the Smith land grants. I think that the questioner makes the really important point about the narrowness of the access to land as the foundation for generational wealth. And I think that it is, I said that that Smith had recruiters working with him, and they were saying that it was free and unconditional and untrammeled or unfettered maybe grant of land, which is not true. And those recruiters were actually Black men, prominent Black activists and abolitionists, including James McCune Smith, who, like Garrett Smith, I think many of whom were really invested in both respectability as a sort of political tool, and also temperance. Like temperance was a big deal in the antebellum period, and there were intimate connections between temperance and anti-slavery and the politics of racial justice. David Ruggles, who was one of the leaders or one of the original founders of the New York Committee of Vigilance, was like super into various sorts of like cold water cures and temperance, and like a lot of the what we might say is like very out there aspects of 19th century Black politics. So it was a I guess I'll say that temperance was to people like Garrett Smith a virtue in its own right and a path to justice for Black people.
So one question notes that one objection to the current protests, especially the small element of violence, is not on the grounds that they're inappropriate or unruly, but on the grounds that they give fuel to the right-wing assertion that American cities are lawless war zones. And the wonder, is there historical precedent for that kind of objection? How have people responded in the past?
How have people responded to the claim that cities are lawless war zones?
Or that it gives fuel? Yeah, I'm not quite sure there where that was.
I think that I don't know. I think that historically people have been able to reflect on the realities of urban life and the extent to which it is and has been, since the mid 20th century for many African Americans, especially a life of diminished opportunities or diminishing opportunities. The decline of investment in public and social services, the rise in policing in urban spaces, and the creation of a system of mass incarceration. These things have made it harder for Black people to live in cities, and I think that's one important aspect of what people would argue is like, this is what's wrong in the cities, and this is actually the source of any sort of what is seen as sort of disorder and chaos, is the external forces acting upon people who live in cities. I think that other people would also, and I think it's also important to highlight cities as places of flourishing and productivity and generative and creative artistic and cultural endeavor and intellectual endeavor, right? I think that I guess I would say that the historical and contemporary reality is one in which cities are places of diverse human flourishing, and highlighting that truth is the best argument against the claim that cities are places of, or simply places of chaos. Yeah.
So the gendered aspect to these ways of acting for citizenship and citizenship rights, I wondered if you could go a little bit more into how gender played a role.
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple answer is that in most spaces of public Black politics, Black women were denied the same access to have their voices heard, to make their voices heard. One of the things that I found interesting and that I really worked on in revising the book from the dissertation was trying to bring out the analysis of things like the City Hall mob and the women who actually took part. The fact that men like Samuel Cornish said that Black women shouldn't be involved in politics doesn't actually mean that Black women weren't involved in politics. And so there are interesting ways in which scholars have written about, and I've tried to follow some of the things that that Black women did that sort of built upon their prescribed roles, right? So one of the examples I have of this is in 1857, there is a parade in Boston of a group called the Liberty Guard, which was a Black militia that was established despite a Massachusetts state law that said there could be no Black militias. So the militia goes on this parade, and they come back for this reception. And during the reception, one of the women who is connected with and supporting these militiamen presents and gives a short speech and presents to the leader of the militia a flag that is an American flag that was given to a group of Black soldiers during the Revolutionary War that has been preserved and is being repurposed. And into this American flag, she has knit the name and the symbol of the Liberty Guard. And so there's this way that it's like, this is, I mean, you know, maybe like the most literal kind of political statement about Black people's place, right? She is knitting the Liberty Guard into the fabric of the American flag. And I think that that's a thing that, you know, is quite traditional women's work, but is also quite intensely political. You know, I guess I would for anybody who wants to learn more about or know more about Black politics, I would or Black women's politics in this period, I would point you toward Erica Armstrong Dunbar's book, A Fragile Freedom, which is about Black women in antebellum Philadelphia, and is terrific.
Thank you. This has been so wonderful. We are so grateful that you came. I hope for all of you who found Dr. Bonner's talk absolutely scintillating and interesting, that you know that you can buy it on bookshop.org with the Philadelphia Athenaeum's site there. Or if you're a shareholder of the Athenaeum, you can get it for 20% discount at the University of Pennsylvania Press. If you need that code, and give us a call tomorrow or give us a little email and we will send that to you. And wanted to remind you, upcoming events this Thursday night, we'll have Peniel Joseph speaking on his new book, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. The next Tuesday evening, we will have Derek Dreher, the executive director of the Rosenbach, talking about revitalizing the Rosenbach, or how letting people touch things turn transactions into transformations. So I hope you'll register and continue to come back for more programs with us. And join me now in thanking Dr. Christopher Bonner for a fantastic talk tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hopefully future conversations with you as you continue with your research. Maybe when you do